Hello, welcome to Musicians Roundtable. I'm Jeffrey Goodman, and today I'm speaking with Jerry Willard. Jerry is in Vermont, I'm in Los Angeles, and we're going to be looking at the Baroque guitar, romantic guitar, and modern guitars. I'd like to begin by talking a little bit about the Baroque guitar. And I know that the guitar music from, for instance, the time of Gaspar Sanz and those generations were often written for the guitar, for the Baroque guitar. So can you tell us a little bit about the Baroque guitar? And I think you have one there.
I have one, yes, I do. So this is a Baroque guitar that was made by Patrick Caruso in Long Island, New York, about 20 years ago. And this guitar, in many ways, changed my life because I remember I was teaching at Stony Brook at the time, and I had to do a guitar course. And I was walking into my into school that day, and I was thinking to myself how much I know about my field since I've been in it for such a long time. And then I started to research the Baroque guitar, and I realized I knew so little. And I was reminded what one of my teachers said: when you begin to realize how little you know is when you're starting to learn something. And so that was my own personal introduction to this. But Patrick Caruso made me a very wonderful instrument. As you can see, I've scratched it up sadly, but it's got this bear cloth spruce on the top, Halfelfichter it's called, and maple on the back and sides. It does this wonderful tail piece, and of course it has friction gears. The Baroque guitar really has a 150-year history, and it was known in Spain, in France, and in Italy. And the tuning maintained itself relatively the same. So this tuning that's on here is the same pitches as the modern guitar, but only 5 strings. So there's a single first string, known as a chanterelle, which is singing string. And then there's the next 2 strings are unison, the unison B. And the next string is an octave G with the octave on the thumb side. And the 4th string, it's an octave D with the octave on the thumb side. And the 5th string is a high A, which would be the same A as the 2nd fret of the 3rd string. So with this, because the tuning is the high notes are on the thumb side, it can work a little bit like a 5-string banjo, in that a lot of the pitches are the high pitches are being produced by the thumb. So you wind up with things like a technique called a campanella, which is a bell-like sound, which sounds really difficult to do, but trust me, there's nothing to it. Because what's happening is you're playing those strings going across between the fingers and the thumb. So when I was first learning about the Baroque guitar, I thought to myself that somehow or another they were a more primitive species, and that somehow or another when they really learned about the guitar, they would add the 6th string. But I was thinking in terms of a person that was a bass guitar player, like we have. A guitar is essentially a bass instrument, but in this instrument there's no bass. There's only an implication of bass. So as a result, you don't use the traditional guitar technique with the thumb on the bass and the fingers on the top. Boom, chink. We don't have that. So as a result, there's a lot more strumming. And there's types of techniques where that will be followed with the thumb. So the sound is quite wonderful, and by doing these types of techniques, it tends to expand the range. The finger will start the raschiato, and the thumb will follow. Just some more things about it that's very interesting to me is I always thought I would look at the tied-on frets, and I think, my gosh, couldn't they put a fret on there? And actually, the answer was yes. If they wanted to do it, they would have done it. But in that period, the problem of pitch hadn't been worked out. Some people are using a just intonation, a mean intonation, or a tempered. And the movable frets give you much more flexibility. And one of the wonderful things about that period and the way they thought about music was they thought if you would understand how the vibrations work together, you would understand how the universe works. So the fact they were tied on frets were a very important philosophical point. And I just find that wonderful because, you know, there's a tendency always with early music to think that Darwinism has marched forward and has arrived at a pinnacle of you and I. When actually, and if you go back and look at ancient music that way, you're going to get it wrong, because in terms of the way that they lived and worked and the sound that they wanted, this instrument was perfect. And so you can see that, for instance, a really good example of that, like in terms of the Campanellas. I was going to mention there's this little Pavane. I'll play more of it later, but there's a part that uses the Campanellas, which is this. Well, when the early musicologists took this off the tablature, what it sounded like was this. Which is really pretty dull when it's compared to this. So it took a while for people to catch up with this instrument. The other thing that's wonderful about it is as a continual instrument in Baroque orchestra, it's absolutely the best. And I understand with the theorbos and the arch lutes, I mean, visually, those things are beautiful. And the sound, especially in some Bach pieces that I've heard, are quite beautiful. But nothing in our world cuts through an orchestra like this little thing does. So if I really want to push it, for instance, and you know, when I was doing this Raschiato where I was falling with a thumb, you can go. So it'll really bite, you know, and so you can actually, that'll cut right through an orchestra. I remember years ago, I played the chords for the 5th Brandenburg Concerto, which has the big harpsichord part. And there I was with the Baroque guitar doing essentially what a rhythm guitar player would do. And the effect was wonderful. It gave it a very sort of a body sense, especially at the cadences that you wouldn't normally have. So the tuning that I mentioned, I want to just mention one thing. The tuning that I said is these tunings would change oftentimes. I think probably if you said, what is the Baroque guitar tuning? It would be, you know, B, G, D, E, B, G, D, and then A with a high A and octaves. But the reality was that they experimented a lot with the tuning, and every area tended to use different tunings. But this is the main one that has come down to us. A lot of other Baroque guitarists are now using a lower A string also. And the tuning I mentioned to you is not quite authentic. I cheat just a little bit. I do E, B, and then a G with a high G. And actually, if you're being technically orthodox, it should be a unison G. But this high G gives me some very high pitches if I need it, without having to go here. So, so that's it. Let me play a little bit of this Pavane.
So this is the Gaspar Sanz Pavanas.
Gaspar Sanz, yes. sort of see how you intersperse the raschiato with plucking puntiato with the fingers, free stroke. You know, the big problem with this instrument is that the bass is an implied bass. And so there's always a problem with that, because if a bass is an implied bass, then it's very hard to add a real bass to it without ruining it. The Bach violin sonatas have the same problem. If you notice, there are some guitar players that play those that play no basses at all, and say, well, that sounds strange. That sounds like a violin piece being played on the guitar. But then if they start to add basses, then you think, wait, that's too heavy now. Because the same problem with the Bach suites, that's an implied bass that's going on. So the problem with this, with an implied bass, and this is a line that I use a lot, and to me, it really expresses what it is. If I go to an artist and I want to learn to do art, right, and I say, okay, I'm going to draw a cat. I draw a cat with every single whisker, and it looks awful. And a real artist comes up and makes 2 lines, and his cat looks much more like a cat than my cat. Because my cat, I've tried to make it look like a real cat, while he's only made an implication of a cat. So that happens here. So it's meant to fool the ear. You think you're hearing bass. But the lowest note in that is actually an E on the first line. So, and it's meant to fool the ear. So, you know, some of the manuscripts back in those days would look so strange when they tried to write it out in terms of notation, that they would make a note that would say, this is going to look really strange, but trust me, when you play it, it'll sound all right, because the tuning itself is so strange. And you have all these notes that are compressed into a very small area, you know.
That's lovely. Now,
Yeah.
was there another, a second piece of Sanz that you were going to play a part of that?
Yeah, I think this would be good to show.
The Rujero, perhaps?
Yeah, the Rujero. By the way, I love your version of that. And I have no problems with playing this music on the modern guitar. It's part of the tradition of the instrument. It's just that, like you said very well, that from the Baroque guitar to the modern guitar, you really have to transcribe it almost as if you're transcribing to a different instrument, even though it's with the same tuning, you know. So the Rujero, if I play that rather strictly, well, first let me just say one thing quickly. There's an ornament to begin, and so it'd be this. Well, on the tablature, it actually tells you to do this. So the ornament comes from the 4th string because of the octave. You see, so it really, so you don't always have to do the ornament here. This is a little heavier because you've got the 4th string also. So. Now, that's pretty strict the way that it's written. And the problem with Sanz is you can't approach it like you're approaching Bach. Like if you're going to do, say, the first violin sonata, the Adagio, for instance, that's pretty specific the way he wants that. You know, a lot of Sanz is more like a lead sheet. So I could do it that way, but I could also do this. So you can sort of make it up, you know, and that's just one little, I'm extemporizing that, but then you could also do it and add ornaments too. So you could take this little piece and do something quite grand with it. While with the Bach, you wouldn't so much. You'd look at that and say, wait, this is pretty serious stuff, and he wants exactly this. It's very clear. But with the Sanz, there's a tendency to say, look, have a little fun here, and to bring out the folky aspect of it. The one thing that people must realize about Baroque music is, like jazz, it's built from the bottom up. You actually start with a bass line with an ornamental top. That's why oftentimes with Baroque music, it doesn't, the top, the melodic line doesn't have to be precisely rhythmical. You can do inégales. You know, you can do, instead of playing, you can play with the rhythm, you know, and so that's a really important point. Even though this doesn't have bass, you know, oftentimes in your situation would be you would be working with a bass player or some sort of bass instrument, you know. Yeah. But you're exactly right. That's how this would have been used in that day.
So perhaps we'll come back to this. I was thinking that maybe we could take a look at the early Romantic guitar.
Yes.
And I think we have two of them today. And yeah. One is kind of early Romantic and one is a little bit later Romantic.
Now, I might have some tuning problems here. This is a Rene Lacote that was built in, I believe, 1820. He sometimes didn't date these, so there's actually an 18 with a underline, so there's no date. But I talked to David Hershey years ago, who was the curator at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and he said it was probably 1820 is what he thought. So you can see how it looks, and it's got this wonderful, all kinds of cracks in the back, but a wonderful piece of rosewood. And I've asked many makers about fixing the cracks, and everyone has said no, just leave it. It's been like this for 100 years, you know. So you're better off not to hurt it. So the machine heads are really from the 19th century. But they're probably not original. At least I've been told that probably these are originally friction pegs, and somewhere somebody along the line cut this in and put machine heads on it. But as you can see, it's a wonderful example of 19th century work. And of course, they're ivory pegs. The inside, I don't know if you can see that, but the inside is laminated with spruce. And that was apparently very common at that time. One of his students, Grobert, also did the same exact making with rosewood and lamination. But I bought this in the 1980s, and in those days, these guitars were worth very little. No one really knew what to do with them, and there'd been very little historical work in the guitar's history, you know. And so someone called up, a friend of mine, and said, "I have it for sale. Would you like to buy it?" And I said, sure. So Pat Caruso, the guy that made my Baroque guitar, we jumped in the car in Long Island and drove nonstop to Cleveland. I picked it up and I brought it back. And I didn't know what to do with it at first. I mean, I said, well, this is very nice. You know, it's got a nice sound, you know. But I had no reason to really use it except just to have it because it was a nice thing to have. And then one day, I was doing some work with a mezzo soprano, and we were doing Schubert songs. And since this is kept at low pitch, it was the perfect instrument for that because she's a low voice. We're automatically coming in at a lower tessitura. So we went to the hall and I started to play, and suddenly this guitar sounded fantastic. It was the loudest guitar I had on the stage, even more than my modern guitars. And of course, it looks like a toy, you know. And it's a good lesson in that the size of the guitar or the amount of bass in the guitar doesn't necessarily mean it's going to project. It just means that the person that's playing it hears it louder. It's a really important point, and you really have to. And I can't say it enough, not for anybody listening, but for myself, because it's very easy, what I call to be romanced by the bass. The bass will make it sound good to you, but it won't necessarily project the sound. We're going to prove the old adage: it's better to play a few notes out of tune than not to play at all. And I'd like to say also, just so you know, these are gut strings. So I hadn't, for many years, I was using nylon on it and keeping it at low pitch. And I went to a friend of mine's house one day who had a Lacote, and I was playing on it, and he said, "By the way, those are gut strings." And I would have thought they were nylon. So in this case, you'll hear it with gut. So just a little bit of this. what you get with a smaller body is you get clarity. And the big problem with the modern guitar is the lack of clarity. And you find that out, once you start to record with it, you find that out right away. Like with these little instruments, all I have to do is turn the mic on and the mic loves them. It just sounds great. I have very little going on here. It's very clear, out of tune, but clear. So in a way, there's something wonderful about the clarity of that. So when you're playing something that, here's a similar piece, right? So even though I hit this note rather hard, it doesn't overdo it. So in a way, the dying away of the sound, say more quickly than a modern guitar, is not such a bad thing, because you get more of a, I guess as you say, more of a homogeneous sound to it. So if I do, let's just try something. Let me go from this to a modern guitar. All right, just to hear the difference. Now we're going to change pitches because this is low. So this guitar would have been made about 15 years ago. Now, I don't know how it sounds on your end, but this sounds very rich, you know, and it's nice in a way, but it's a different thing.
Now it's remarkable to hear them one next to the other.
Yeah.
So do you have a later 19th century guitar that we're going to look at?
Yeah. Before we leave this one, before we make that transition, I just want to say that with the Lacote guitar, the bracing on the inside is like a lute. It's basically a ladder bracing. You have braces that go this way. And so essentially this is like a lute. It tends to look backward. So this is the tradition, and he's doing that. The next one I show you, the Panormo, in a way looks forward to the modern guitar. And I'll explain that. So this also has gut strings. This is a Louis Panormo. And in this case, since we're on the subject, this is fan braced. It's one of the earliest examples of that. And I got this maybe about 6 years ago. And it was a wonderful guitar then. It's a wonderful guitar now. I put a lot of money into it. It had to be rebuilt, which was done by probably the finest expert in this style in Toronto, Canada, Michael Schreiner. And Michael had gone all over Europe collecting blueprints of the insides of guitars. So he brings out a huge box full of things, and he looked at these, and so he was the one that restored this back to what it was. Wow. You can see the kind of bridge it has, you know.
Beautiful.
Yeah, and the rosewood, of course, in the back is quite lovely. And this was made in 1834. This is signed and dated. The little pins are ivory, and I thought this might have been for a strap, but actually these were, if you put it on the wall, these are to keep the back from touching the wall.
Oh.
Yeah. Which I think would have been pretty important back in those days. I don't think the heating was quite as consistent as we have it now, you know. So, so these machines are new. I have the original ones, but in 1834, the machines I have were made in 1834. So you can say, so the same music on this instrument.
you mind playing that same exact passage on the Lacote?
Not at all, no. That's a good idea.
That's for a difference in 14 years, say about 1820 to 1834, it really is a
Yeah.
world of difference, isn't it?
It's a world of difference. I'm not sure also about the 1820 date, because people have also told me, one maker looked at it and said, I think it's 1830. There's no way to know for sure, but some people have said this later. I only say 1820 because that was the date that was originally given to me. But they both would have been contemporary makers, both of which Sor recommended. But the difference is amazing. This is much more lute-like. And if you notice too, it goes up like a luthier frets go right up to the top, you see.
Mhm.
You know, but you know, after playing these guitars for many years, if I had to choose one, I would choose this one. And I know that the other one sounds richer, but I have that already with the modern guitars. And so with the Panormo, I mean, as much as I love the guitar, I have to apologize to it later for saying this, but I would rather have this. This is more representative to me of the period, while the Panormo is really moving towards a modern guitar. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that are going to disagree with me on that.
Well, that's part of the fun of it.
Part of the fun, absolutely, yeah.
and so what I know from countless enjoyable hours and that I've spent with looking at different guitars, it's always great to sit with a great guitar maker or guitar craftsman and compare and listen to different instruments.
Yeah.
If you had two more Lacotes and two more Panormos, they would all be different from one another. So
absolutely.
I would not immediately come to the conclusion that all Lacotes sound like your Lacote and all Panormos sound like that in terms of that differentiation.
Exactly. Yeah.
There's can be huge differences that are all kind of fascinating and so forth. So one of the questions I would ask you, since we're in the Romantic period, is kind of how has playing these 19th century guitars influenced your thinking about 19th century guitar music, say Sor, Aguado, Giuliani?
Absolutely drastic. First of all, if I would recommend anyone to try to study 19th century guitar music, if you're a student and you want to learn to play the guitar, go to the 19th century. That's the place. All the virtuosos are there, and they all did things that were relatively easy, actually. I mean, some things require chops and fingers, but most of it's pretty easy because they had to be able to play it themselves. First rule of being a virtuoso is always play easy music that sounds great. And so the 19th century guitar music is filled with that repertoire, you know, and that's where you really build up your chops. So what happens is these guys were like rock players. So they had no pedagogy, perhaps, but whatever they made up. Many of them were violin players. So they thought of the guitar in many ways as a large violin. And you see that in the hand position this way. It's almost this, you know, really with the hand here. So as a result, you have people like Mertz and Julian and Sor reaching over with the thumb all the time. So for all you rock guys that are out there playing with the thumb, you don't have to feel bad now because this is a traditional part of the instrument. Mertz even had a sign for it, which was an upside down triangle, which meant you could put your thumb here. Now, I can't do that, but he could, you know, and sometimes he would do it when it's not even necessary because he just was there, you know. And there's that aspect. So there's a freedom to the writing. and a freedom to the way that you approach the instrument that opens you up more. I would advise any student to really study closely the Giuliani 120 exercises, and don't do a modern edition, do the original. And you'll see him using the same finger. With the index finger jumping. And at first it seems like it's just not right. But as you play it, it starts to take you start to say, oh, you know, that actually works in a very strange way. So they were really thinking, in our sense, they were thinking outside the box. Because I was brought up with the Segovia school, you know, and you had to do it the way Segovia did it. And I remember with my teacher, I came in with some ideas dynamically. He says, no, it doesn't go that way. You have to do a forte here, a punticello there, because that's the way Segovia did it. Well, the 19th century guitar really frees you up, you know. For instance, for years, I used to play this. And, you know, in the piece, this piece, I don't remember how it goes now, but this piece was actually quite fast, you know, by Giuliani. Well, you know, he's a guitar player like I am, so he's not going to do something that's impossible to do. But once I started to realize what was going on, what he wants, of course, is this. Then it makes sense. Suddenly you're sitting out below the balcony romancing the young lady, and you're doing, looking completely cool, not this. I mean, that's not going to be cool, you know. So when you start to look at it, you have to look at that music in a way that you have to try to look at it through their eyes. And there's got to be a simple way to do it, you know. Now, I'm not putting these guys down. They're fantastic virtuosos, and believe me, I wish I could play half their repertoire. But a lot of it was easy, you know. And part of the tradition of the instrument was the arpeggio. So you could do, it's not such a big deal now, but you could. So you get on your carriage in Paris, you wind up in Vienna, you jump out and you go. And of course, we know that that's pretty easy to do, but they didn't know it back then. So a lot of the arpeggios were meant to be virtuosic and to wow people, and for not to be particularly difficult to play.
I think also, as you're saying this, I'm kind of remembering, I can't quote it exactly, but in Sor's method book, he's very clear that he doesn't want there to be awkwardness in technique, that all of the writing needed to have a certain kind of dignity and reserve to it. It didn't exclude the virtuosic, but it should definitely not be tortured as far as the unusual and strange demands that would put on
exactly. Yeah. You know, there's something that John Williams said once that I think is a really good saying. It said, if your fingering you're working on doesn't work in 20 minutes, change it. I think for this humble soul, it might be more like 40 minutes or 4 hours. But I get it. But I get his point. In other words, you shouldn't just be beating your head against the wall to try to fix something that's not fixable. And that part of the idea of fingering and part of the idea of playing is to make it easy. That's why we the two reasons we finger is to make it easy and for musical conception both. And so if it doesn't do that, then you need to change it. I can't tell you the number of students I've had come in. They'll be trying to work a passage after months and months and not getting it, you know, and it's time to change it. And the 19th century is great that way because there's a freedom to it. They were the rock stars of their day. They were the Van Halens of their day. Giuliani especially. I mean, he's one of all the guitar players. I'd love to hear him play because, well, I bet he could really play. Anyway, the 19th century guitar is great, and I think anybody that should do it should really try it. There's some wonderful makers out there now making some wonderful copies. You know, lately I've stopped using a footstool, so it's uncomfortable for me now with these old instruments, and I've been playing a lot more modern guitar. So I use one of these things now, so both of my feet are flat on the ground. So if I were going to do that on the modern guitar, I would change a lot of that. I would do more. I would do fuller chords and make it more bassy. That kind of thing. And here, as opposed to this. So now, if I do that, so now for a real contrast.
Wow.
So what do you think? Which one do you like better?
I've got to call my guitar maker and see if I can get one of those made for me.
Yeah.
I'm being pulled in that direction. It's just beautiful.
Yeah. Once you play the repertoire on this, you'll never go back. You'll never go back because there's a lightness and an airiness to it that you just can't get on the modern guitar. As beautiful and rich as it is, you actually don't want the richness.
Thank you, Jerry, for all of this magnificent stuff that you shared with us. It's really great.
Thank you. I really enjoyed doing it. It was a lot of fun.